This picture is the picture of a floor. Now they make what they do over in that land. When they think of a Bible event that may have taken place there, they'll build a little chapel to commemorate that event. It's like a little church building there, and they do go in there and worship, but it's to commemorate those events. Now, I know what we do when we teach. We'll go to a lot of trouble sometime to put up a bulletin board. But what they do, they decorate in a manner that is, they just go all the way out. This floor is made of little bitty tiles. And so they put that all together, and it's a map of the area that covers much of the area where Lori and I were traveling the last couple of weeks. And I want to tell you about some of those Bible places. Tonight I'm going to tell you about Athens. And I'm doing it, I want to talk about the Bible things. There's so much associated with these places. But I want to zero in on the Bible things. And there's 3 things I want us to know about Athens. One is something about the culture that we read about in the New Testament. It's going to have an impact on something in the New Testament. The second is Athens and the Old Testament. Now, Athens isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, but it's behind the scenes, and it explains something that we read in the Old Testament. And then the third, we're going to talk about Athens in the New Testament. So let me take you to Athens, where we were. Here's where it is located, in the Aegean Sea. And so I'm going to have this little arrow following us around as we go to that point. I want you to know where Turkey is and where Greece is, and the sea between Greece and Turkey is the Aegean Sea. That long island down to the south is Crete, and the other island far off over there to the right is Cyprus. And all of these places will enter into these lessons as we talk about this. I'm going to start right here. Look at that arrow pointing down. That is where a man would stand. And that pedestal on which he would stand is called a bema. Now, to help understand this, if we took this pulpit away, and we see this raised platform here, and with all the people gathered out there, standing on this platform, would be standing on that bema. There wouldn't be a pulpit in front of them, but that's where someone would address the citizens of Athens. So keep that bema in mind right there. They had it roped off. I was tempted to step over the rope and stand there to stand where some men that I have read about have stood would have been a thrill, but I respected the little rope off. They didn't want people climbing up there. So I just stood aside and at that bema. Now there it is over there on the right, that bema. But from that area, you can see the Acropolis. That's in the middle. And that's where the Parthenon is. The model is in Athens. And then that other hill, from that arrow kind of slanting down, is Mars Hill, of which we're going to have something to say in a few moments. But I want you to notice that area out in front of that bema. Something very significant happened right there. These Greek cities were not part of a nation. They were independent city-states, either ruled by kings or by tyrants. And a tyrant didn't mean an oppressive ruler. It was usually a ruler that the people just loved, but it wasn't really a legal ruler. But they were ruled by kings and tyrants. And in Athens, they said, why do we have to be ruled by kings and tyrants? We think we can rule ourselves. We'll go up to this Pnyx, P-N-Y-X. Sometimes the P is silent the way people say it, but most of the time it's pronounced Pnyx. We'll assemble at that Pnyx. We'll go down into the Agora. That's the place where everyone would mingle, and we'll write out the things we're going to discuss. People can read that like they'd read a newspaper, and then gather at the Pnyx, and then we, as the citizens of Athens, will make our own decisions, and we will govern ourselves. Here's what the thing would have looked like, so in a model that I've seen, and much of that is gone now. But I want you to look back over this open area and imagine that filled with the citizens of Athens. Maybe some 6,000 of them gathered there to hear someone speak from the bema to that great assembly. Now, here is the New Testament connection. That occurred about 600 BC. 600 years before Christ. It's about the time that Nebuchadnezzar had come in the first time to take Daniel off to Babylonian captivity. Come to Jerusalem and take Daniel into Babylonian captivity. At about that time is when the citizens of Athens decided they would govern themselves. The populace was called the demos. And so that form of government is called democracy. What we're looking at here is called the birthplace of democracy. Rule by the people. But here's the New Testament connection. They had a name for that assembly. They would all be down doing their business in the city, and the call would go forth. We've got to go to the Pnex. We've got a decision to make about our city. And so all the citizens would gather there, and they called that assembly the ecclesia. Now there it is in the, well, it's supposed to be the Greek up front, but I didn't change it. But there it is, ecclesia. It's a word, ek meaning out. Ecclesia meaning called. The out called. We'd say the called out, the assembly. And that's the word that is used the first time in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18, where Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, my ecclesia, my rule, my kingdom, and I'll gather all the saints together unto me. Well, what we're looking at here then, when we see this, is not just the birthplace of democracy, but that's where that word originated that is so important to us in the New Testament and comes to us today. So that's the cultural influence. Now let me tell you something about the Greeks that have to do with the Old Testament. Athens flourished under their self-rule. There were more people that were thriving now because they had private land ownership. They could make profits. They were working in capitalism, and they were just thriving in more than the little area of Athens could support. And so they started establishing colonies. This red area was what Greece became. All that red area is where people from Greece would leave the island of Greece and the city-states of Greece and establish colonies. Like one of the philosophers said, they were like ducks around a pond. And so there's Greeks all over this area. Now, I want you to notice this part of it here. I've zeroed in on Greece, and you see that yellow circle that I have there. There were Greek cities over in that part of the world that we now call Turkey. Now, these are free Greeks ruling themselves. But the Persians showed up. They were conquering the world. And the Persians marched through what we call Asia Minor, or now we call it Turkey, and they took those cities and brought them under Persian rule. The Greeks, having been free, did not like being ruled by the Persians. And so they rebelled against Persia. And Darius decided, I'm going to bring that rebellion under control. And he marched with his Persian army from those lands of Mesopotamia and the Tigris-Euphrates River across the globe over into Turkey. and subdued those cities under his rule. But it wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. Those folks fought back, and he found out they were being supplied by Athens. And that's where the end of that arrow is. Athens had established those colonies, and Athens was supporting those colonies in their contest with the Persians. And so they had a more difficult time than they thought they would have in suppressing those Greeks. When Darius found out that they were being supported by Athens, he said, well, where's Athens? We'll just go take Athens. And so that's what he did. He got his army ready. They crossed the Aegean Sea, and they landed on the plains of Marathon. And there, the greatest empire that the world had ever seen was right on the shores, not far from this little city-state of Athens. All over Greece, the cities were saying, we better capitulate to the Persians and allow them to rule over us or they'll destroy us. But the free men of Athens said, no, we will fight them. And volunteers from some of those city-states came, and the Athenians marched over the mountains to meet them on the plains of Marathon. And they got there, they found out they were outnumbered about 5-1. But the Athenians didn't fight like the Persians. The Athenians had learned to fight together in a great phalanx where they would use their shields and march in columns, and the Persians were used to just going out individually and fighting. And that Greek phalanx marched out against that mighty army of the Persians, and they drove them back to their ships and drove them away from their shores. It was a victory they did not expect to win. And a runner named Phidippides wanted to be the first to carry the news to Athens. And so he took off running, and he ran with all his might over those mountains and came running into the city of Athens exclaiming, we won, we won, we defeated the Persians. And he collapsed in the street as all of Athens rejoiced. And when they're all rejoicing all over the city, he dies right there in those streets. That was the first marathon. The distance that he ran matches the distance that is now run as a marathon. Meanwhile, back in Persia, Darius died, and his son Xerxes began to rule on the throne. And in the Bible, it's a derivation of Xerxes. It's hard to explain how that comes about, but there's a derivation of Xerxes. So that comes out in the Hebrew, Ahasuerus. And we read about him in the book of Esther. It's Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is that Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia. He made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces. He showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. He had quite the gathering of all his nobles all over his empire, and this was in the 3rd year of his reign. Ask the historians, and they will tell you that Xerxes, in the 3rd year of his reign, gathered together the chiefs of all his provinces and formed the largest army that had ever been on the face of the earth. The estimates of that army range so far that it's hard to ever know exactly how big that was, but you're not going to be far away to call it the 1,000,000-man army. And he formed that army to avenge the defeat at Marathon and to regain the honor lost by his father to Persia. And so he marched that army across. They actually about the the water separating Greece and Turkey, he built a bridge across that, a floating bridge of his naval ships where they marched from ship to ship. And they marched across and they came into Macedonia and they were coming down to destroy Athens. Now the Spartans had been absent at Marathon and they didn't like not being there when the battle was fought. So the Spartans got out ahead and they held the pass at Thermopylae. 200 Spartans against a 1,000,000-man army. And they got in that pass where that army had to pass through, and those Spartans brought that army to a halt. There were so many that someone said, if you try to fight those Persians, there's so many, their arrows will come across and they'll block out the sun. And the general said, then we'll fight them in the shade. And they fought to the death at Thermopylae, holding off that Persian army, until finally they were able to break through, and there was nothing now standing between that army and the city of Athens. But it gave Athens the time that they needed to flee. And the citizens of Athens fled. Now, if you see where that arrow was pointing down, that's about where Athens would be. The seaport is Piraeus. And they fled to their ships and came over to this island called Salamis. And they had their little Greek navy out there that was prepared to defend them. But not only had Xerxes brought the largest army in the world, he brought the largest navy that the world had ever seen to bear. And they came up against those Greek ships, and these Greeks walked into this little narrow place where they knew the currents, they knew the winds, they knew the waters, and those mighty Persian ships were not able to maneuver. And the Greeks engaged in battle against that Persian navy and sunk over 200 of their ships, losing only 5 of theirs. Up there on the hill, overlooking that sea, was Ahasuerus. And he watched his navy being destroyed. He knew he had lost. And so he returns back to Shushan the palace. And that, to comfort him, is when he found his wife, Esther. Isn't that interesting? Athens is in the background of the story of Esther. Well, he had destroyed Athens, but after he had destroyed Athens and the Athenians had driven them off, Athens was now the great city of Greece. And the little city-states poured their resources into Athens to celebrate their victory and to save them from those Persians. And that's when they built the Parthenon, almost 2,400 years ago. Those are columns of that Parthenon that are still standing on that Acropolis. And I took this picture because if you look closely, you can see the sea beyond those columns, and you can see the ships on that sea where that battle was fought. There it is up close. You see the ships that are out there? That's where that battle took place. That's why they built the Parthenon there, to overlook that part of the sea where they had won. And this was to thank their gods for saving them from the Persians. Now, the Greeks became a very religious people, honoring their gods for all of their greatness. And it also became the place of the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who was the tutor of Alexander the Great, that Macedonian, that finally brought the Greek states under his subjection and then marched with his Greek Macedonian army against Persia and destroyed the Persians. And now Greece ruled the world. But Alexander the Great died about 33 years of age. And as the generals gathered around him and they said, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" He said, "To the strongest." And so the Greeks fought one another and they became weak. And it was easy then for the Romans to move in and take Greece and Turkey and Israel and Egypt. And in that battle, the people at Corinth withstood the Romans, and so that ancient city of Corinth was destroyed. But about 50 years before Jesus, Julius Caesar says, we will rebuild Corinth. It will be the Roman city of Greece, and it will be the main city of that country. And so Athens lost much of its glory to Corinth. That is, its economic glory and its political glory. But it maintained its cultural glory and its intellectual glory. And so the great people of the Roman world would send their young people to Athens for their education, and it still maintained that reputation. And that's the way it was when Paul showed up. We read in Acts chapter 17 and verse 15. And they conducted Paul and brought him into Athens, and received commandment unto Silas and Timotheus to come to him with all speed, and they departed. Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. That had happened beginning way back after that victory over the Persians. And they had added and added and added to this. And the Romans had not yet carried off those Greek statues and gods. And so they were just everywhere, all over the city, statues and gods to everything that they could think of. They called those statues and memorials, they called them their devotions. He said he saw the city wholly given to idolatry, and he disputed in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons in the market daily with them that met with him. The market, that's the agora. And I'll have to talk about that more at another time, but that's where everyone would gather to exchange goods and also to exchange ideas. And it just created the ideal opportunity for Paul to go down there and start teaching Christ. There is a picture of Mars Hill. This is part of the agora, not the Parthenon there, but that open area down there with the trees, that's the agora itself, where Paul would have confronted those philosophers from Athens and spoke to them. Now, there were certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics. There was all kinds of philosophies in Athens. The Epicureans, they did not believe in an afterlife. They thought the essence of living is to enjoy this life the best we can now. The Stoics, they still believed in the gods and had the idea that the gods had all things worked out and there was no way to work against fate. Your fate was sealed, and the best you could do is just accept your situation and make the best of it. Those were the kinds of philosophies that Paul confronted. Well, they heard Paul, and they said, what will this babbler say? Which is not a compliment. He seems to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine is, whereof thou speakest, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. The Areopagus, the hill of Ares, or the hill of Mars, Mars Hill. Whether it was on that actual hill or not is not the point. There was, back in their history, the fact that trials had taken place, and those that would govern those trials became known as that Areopagus group. And so Paul was going to speak before them, possibly right on that very hill. And they were going to try Paul's teachings. It's the place where they had tried Socrates. And finding Socrates guilty of bringing forth strange teachings, they condemned Socrates to death. And now they're going to try Paul. What is it that this babbler is saying? And so sometimes Paul is called the second Socrates of Athens. Well, if you go to Mars Hill today, you see this plaque that is there just as you make that final ascent. And on that bronze plaque, spelled out in Greek is the very sermon that Paul preached to those Athenians. All the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but to hear some new thing, hear or tell some new thing. Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, said, "Ye men of Athens, I perceive you're too superstitious. For I have passed by and behold your devotions and found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, I declare unto you." That sounds a little insulting, but it was not. That's just the way it comes across in translation. I think the American Standard Version says, "I find you to be very religious." He's not insulting them. He's complimenting them for trying to seek after God. And they had this altar to the unknown God, and so unknowingly they worship. That's what it means, they ignorantly worship. It's the same word, the unknown God and the ignorant worship. We're talking about the same word here. And so he's simply acknowledging what they're doing, complimenting them on being very religious. And then he said this, "I'm going to tell you about that God. And it's a God unlike any God they had known in all of their mythologies. God that made the world and all things therein, saying he's Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands." Can you see him on Mars Hill? Right in the site of the Parthenon and all of the others, and the temple to Zeus and to Vulcan and all those gods all around. He said he doesn't dwell in these temples made with hands. It says, "Neither is he worshipped with men's hands as though he need anything, seeing he giveth life and breath and all things, and made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and to determine the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek after the Lord." See, that's what the Greeks were doing. They were seeking the Lord and couldn't find him. And God wanted you to do that they should seek after the Lord, that happily they might feel after him and find him. He's not far from every one of us. "For in him we move and live and have our being." And then he quoted their own poets, that we are the offspring of God. "For as much as then we are the offspring of God, we ought not think the Godhead is likened to gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device." And again, you got to realize that was all around them as Paul is speaking of these things. He said the time of this ignorance, that's that same word. You didn't know this. There was a time when you not knowing this, God could tolerate that. The times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent. That means this is a God that could be found, and a God that could be known, and a God to whom we were responsible. He said he had appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom hath ordained, and have given assurance unto all men to make sure you know this is right. He rose from the dead. Well, now that was shocking to those Greeks that were gathered there. They heard this and they heard of the resurrection. Some mocked. Others said, "We need to hear more about this. We'll hear more about this." And Paul departed from among them, but certain men clave to him and believed. Among them was Dionysius the Areopagite, the man responsible for that Areopagus, and then a woman named Damaris and others with them, a very small group. And from there, Paul leaves Athens. We no longer read about Athens in the New Testament. But years have passed since Paul preached there, and now everything has changed. I want you to notice this. There's the Parthenon, and all over the city of Athens you see this flag. It is the Greek national flag. And what do you see on that flag? You see a cross. And that cross represents the embrace of Christianity all over the land of Greece. At least their idea of what Christianity is. A lot of it much different than what we read in the New Testament. But that is now their flag, and that means more to them. Their Christianity, as they understand, means more to them than all that ancient past and all those monuments. And there in the city of Greece, on the first day of the week, we gathered together with those Christians under this sign, Ecclesia to Christo. There's that ecclesia. But it's not the ecclesia of the Panax. It's the ecclesia of Christ. It is the church of Christ in Athens. Now, I want you to go back and think. 2,600 years ago, they coined that word, ecclesia. For those who had been called out from the marketplace to gather together to see how they could rule themselves, or something that was more important than anything they were doing in their cities. And now we have the ecclesia of Christ that calls us out of this world to something more important than any other thing that we are doing. And I want you to think what that looks like. Can you imagine someone standing there on that bema? I want you to imagine a preacher preaching God's word, and before him that assembly that has come together to worship God. To help you imagine that, I did this. Doesn't that look like us? I mean, here I am. I'll be the preacher standing on this bema. And there's the assembly before me. And now we're preaching Christ. So that was the image that was in that idea of the ecclesia. Jesus used that word for a meaning. He saw back into the past what that word represented and what it was. And he saw into the future what we're doing now. When we gather together as the saints of God to worship him and to hear the preaching of his word. Well, that is Athens. So remember three things. The cultural ecclesia that comes to us. The background of the story of Esther. And then Paul preaching the resurrection of Christ. It seemed very little received at the time, but now has come to dominate that entire culture. We today can be part of that ecclesia. We are called out of the world by the gospel of Christ. We should leave every other thing behind as lesser importance to that to which we are called. And if tonight you hear that call, you're moved to become a Christian, you can be added to that assembly by God himself when you're baptized into Christ. So with that, Tommy, I extend the invitation while we stand and sing.